You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. I was grateful to be invited to travel recently with General C.Q. Brown, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. We went down to Maxwell Air Force Base and Auburn University, and on the way back on the plane, we recorded an episode of the podcast. Enjoy the show. You run a military service. You must have a pretty intense schedule. I've seen a bit of it today. Are you just working 12 hours, 7 days a week? How do you maintain the battle rhythm that you have, and how does that affect your staff, and how do you sustain that? What's it like?
It does take some stamina, and so, part of how I start my days, the first thing I do is I usually get up to go work out. So I'm up, my alarm goes off about 4:50, roll out of bed about 5. We have a home gym that we kind of built after COVID in our house, and sometimes I'll go run, but more times than not, I'll work out for 30, 40 minutes, cool off, have breakfast, do some email, then get dressed and head to the office about 7. And then the day is pretty much full of meetings until my last meeting is usually about 5. So I'm out the door by about 5:36, and then come home, have dinner, watch the evening news, and then I will do my homework. So I get homework each night. And then on the weekends, I try to block out time where, I have homework, but I will block out half a day either on Saturday morning, sleep in a little bit, go do something, try to go to dinner. Shereen and I try to go to dinner either Saturday or Sunday night. We get to church about 50% of the Sundays, depending on how much homework I have and what I have up the next week. And I try to prioritize that schedule as well, because there's certain things that are important but not as important, and I will push them off a bit more. But I also try to build in time for myself. Whether it's go for a bike ride, or go spend time with Shereen, or just try to read a little bit or veg, and watch sports or something.
How do you run a staff process to support what you need to do, and how is that different from past leadership roles that you've had?
Actually, I don't think it's too much different. I think part of it is setting kind of some ground rules of how I want to operate, and by setting those ground rules and setting those expectations, and then holding myself and the staff accountable to those expectations, it makes it easy for them. One of the things I'm as an engineer, I'm very process oriented. And so I really believe in building processes that are repeatable so we can focus less on the process and more on the substance. And so by doing that, I have a rhythm that my front office staff understands, I understand, and they know kind of what to expect from me and know kind of what to expect from them, which makes things go maybe a bit smoother.
The Air Force is making a choice to divest itself of certain platforms so that it can invest more money in future platforms, future technology. This process has proven controversial in some quarters. And how do you see that process is going, and what's your vision for the future makeup of the Air Force, particularly with China as the pacing threat?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'd tell you is, when I first came into the job, I did not allow the staff to say divest to invest. The reason I did that is because as soon as you say divest, people quit listening to what you're trying to invest in. So I start the conversation on the threat and where the threat is, what we need to do to go against that threat, and look at, and as we collaborate and talk to our key stakeholders, whether it's part of the Air Force, whether it's part of Department of Defense, or on Capitol Hill, that we agree that we don't want to lose to the threat. And since we agree on that, that means we got to make sure we're transforming the Air Force in the future, and how we balance from where we are today to get to where we need to get to for the future. And part of that is really, as you understand the threat, thinking about the capabilities we require to get there. Many of the platforms we operate today are the same platforms we operate in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, with some upgrades. And so with that in mind, you got to make that transition and forecasting where the threat, not where it is today, where it's going to be in the future, and how we have to evolve to get there. At the same time, think about the capacity we have today, because if a crisis happens today, we still got to have capability. And so it's a mix of capability and capacity. And so I talk about the aspect of having balanced risk. So I don't think that the combatant command should take all the risks. I don't think the United States Air Force should take all the risks. So how do we balance that risk between what the combatant command needs and what the Air Force needs to be able to provide in the future? So future combatant commanders, future airmen, future joint teammates will have the capabilities required. So, and then the last thing I'd say, as we do think about the threat, the more we understand not only the threat itself, but how they operate, how they make their decisions, that is a value and understanding of how you might do deterrence. And that to me is an area that we can continue to grow our expertise on particularly when it relates to the People's Republic of China. Having started my career during the Cold War, where we really understood the Soviet Union, we got to get to that same level of thought process with not just the People's Republic of China, but I just say, when you look at the global environment and the threat, the more our airmen understand that, the more we understand that as leaders, the better we can perform to provide those capabilities and make the assessment of, are we making the right investments to transform the Air Force?
What bets are you or predictions are you able to make or willing to make about what that future Air Force looks like? Maybe not when your tenure is done, but 5-10 years into the future.
I do think that we'll have a combination of uncrewed aircraft. As the Air Force is working through collaborative combat aircraft, aspects of autonomy, aspects of artificial intelligence. I think some parts of our organizational construct could change. I also look at the makeup of the airmen we have today. The question I ask myself today, are the career fields we have today the same career fields we're going to have 10, 15 years from now? I think we'll have probably more, data scientists, behavioral scientists, those that have cultural expertise. At the same time, you have those that have the operational expertise. Particularly if you're trying to deter, you got to have those that actually are thinking, the deep thoughts. At the same time, you have the operators that are going to be able to operate. So I see the force mix and personnel being a bit different as well.
Can you talk more about the concept of combat collaborative aircraft? And something I'm trying to understand is it complementary to the loyal wingman concept, or is it in tension with it in some way?
No, it's not intention. I think we're building on the loyal wingman concept, and the way we're going to look at the collaborative combat aircraft and what we have in this particular budget is focused on 3 lines of effort. First is the platform itself. So, what is the platform that's going to actually do the work? And then there's aspects of autonomy, because the goal is how do you put into that platform levels of autonomy that take the pressure off the crewed aircraft that will be competent, or whatever the control system is going to be. And then there's the organizational construct as the last line of effort. What we're trying to do right now as we do this, we do it all in parallel. So we look at how we would organize a unit with the operators, the maintainers, the support. So then when we bring all this capability forward together, we don't build the platform, then think about the autonomy, then we think about how we organize. You do it all together, and you have trade space between the 3 to figure out how best to bring this capability forward in the future.
The Indo-Pacific being the priority theater, it's a huge space, vast stretches of open ocean. Basing and overflight rights and refueling become really important. What are some recent developments on that front, and where do you think that's going in terms of getting the Air Force the ability to operate it where it needs to across the vast stretches of the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I would say there's several factors related to that. One is the growing collaboration with our allies and partners. In the aspect, and I'll go back to, probably over the course of the 4 years from when I was the commander of Pacific Air Forces, when we came out as a nation with an Indo-Pacific strategy, and to watch some of our allies and partners over time now have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, their own process to increase their defense spending, their own better awareness of the threat. And as we do that, you think through the aspect of access, basic, and overflight, those things become a bit easier to communicate and get agreement on, because we both, we all start to see the threat together. I mean, a good example of that is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement in the Philippines for the additional airfields. That's a conversation that went on with the past Philippine administration. Changing administration, changing an environment, opens the door to be able to do that aspect. So you're seeing some things come along with access, basic, and overflight. The goals of having greater interoperability. The other part that we're also looking at, particularly as we lay in aspects of the budget for this year, is when we look at resilient forward basing, the aspect of pre-positioning. And how do you pre-position capabilities so you can get there a bit faster? So logistically, you're not waiting till the crisis happens. Now try to figure out how you get the capability there. How do we resource in certain areas to have capability closer to where the crisis might be, so you can respond much faster? The one thing I see about the beauty of air power, we can get places in hours and days that take others weeks and months to get to. Having some capability forward actually helps us to get and generate combat air power and incredible combat power much more quickly. I do think we got to continue our pathway on recapitalizing the KC-135 with the KC-46. And then as we look at the next generation air refueling system, how we move that further left and get that process started sooner. The one thing, when you think about the KC-46, it is qualified to refuel every aircraft except for the A-10 right now. We're working through the remote visual system, but the other aspect with the KC-46 is refuelable. I've actually flown the KC-46. I refueled flying a KC-46 behind another KC-46. And then also the aspect that it has a boom and a drogue. So it can, once it gets airborne, it can refuel either Air Force aircraft or Navy Marine Corps aircraft. We can't do that today with the KC-135. We got to make that decision with the 135 before it gets airborne, because we have to put different equipment on the aircraft. So it's going to be all Navy or all Air Force. With the KC-46, it provides much more options. And so from that aspect, as you mentioned, every refueling will be something we got to pay attention to. But I think the path around provides us more options than we have today.
What sort of lessons do you think the Air Force should have identified from what's happening in Ukraine? There's a gap between lessons identified and lessons learned oftentimes. Maybe it's too early to have learned, but what lessons do you think you've identified from what's going on in Ukraine?
Well, I think one of the key areas that I've identified, really from my perspective as an air chief, is the value of air superiority and air power. If you think about what's going on today and how this conflict is, drug on a bit, neither side has air superiority. If you look at the way the Russians have operated, they haven't suppressed the air defenses from Ukraine. The air defenses from Ukraine have actually been able to cause some challenges for the Russians. But at the same time, the Ukrainians don't have the ability to actually take out the air defenses from the Russians, so their Air Force can't be as effective as it possibly could be. And so that is something that, there's a lot of discussion on the amount of artillery, but air power has a way of being able to do certain things. And depending on how you employ, thinking about the doctrine and the capabilities that are provided are important. I would say that the Ukrainians, have done a decent job with the air defense systems that they do have to be able to defend some of their key locations. But it's still a challenge, and I think that's the aspect that we've got to think about. I think the other thing I would take away from this is the value of information and how things played in information space before the conflict started, and how well we've got to think about how things play in the information space to bring together a coalition, to align perspectives, to drive interoperability. And what I've seen is NATO has gotten stronger because of what's happened. Just 2 weeks ago, I met with the new Finnish air chief, or spoke to the new Finnish air chief. And last week, I met with the Swedish air chief, who hopefully will be in NATO in not too distant future. But what it's done for us is actually strengthen us to be able to think about the things we need to be able to do as a joint force, and particularly as air forces. And the thing is, you don't necessarily want to have a crisis to have us do that, but a crisis does help to sharpen our focus in certain areas, and it's helping to sharpen our focus in the aspect of a joint team, a team with our allies and partners, and particularly from an aspect in air power as well.
I suspect you'll agree with this, but one of the reasons why artillery munitions are so important is because there's no air superiority. So it's turned into this, in some parts of the front, this sort of World War I-like slog.
Exactly.
On the ground.
I've said that as I talk to others, that it's just a slog of artillery, just like World War I. And we've got to, we were able to, because of technology and air superiority, to be able to break out of that, as you went into conflicts beyond World War I.
So two follow-up questions from that. One is Ukraine has exposed, even though I've heard this from military officers for years, it's not a new issue for you, but the magazine depth issue, the munition shortage issue, production lines, even for the Air Force, surely. So what is your thinking along those lines?
Well, I think in some cases over time we've focused on platforms versus the complete system. And so it's the aspects of not only the airplane itself for us as an Air Force, but it's the munitions go with, it's the sensors that go with, it's all those parts that go together. And in some aspects, we become, very efficient at the expense of being effective. The one thing I would highlight to you is what's not been helpful is a series of continuing resolutions that makes it unpredictable for the defense industrial base, and even for us as we're trying to determine what we're going to do. And so what you'll see, particularly what we're trying to do in this year's budget is multi-year procurement for munitions. That helps level of predictability for the service. It helps our defense industrial base, particularly not only the primes, but the subcontractors. They have some predictability so they can facilitate, have a workforce, and know we can commit to X number of weapons per year for over a period of time versus this year we're up, next year we're down. And so they're not sure, and it's hard for them to commit. We've got to do more of that and really think about the aspect of putting more money against munitions. And I've seen this before. When I was the Air Component Commander for the Defeat ISIS campaign, and we were dropping the joint direct attack munitions, not only us, but all of our allies and partners. There was a finite supply, and we had to figure out how best to do that. And I sat down. We'd engaged with industry, but we probably didn't follow through collectively across the department like we probably should have. I think this has highlighted that to us. This is why you see this multi-year procurement in this year's budget. I think we need to do more of that going forward, particularly on munitions.
If you have one job, it's to make sure that the force employers can maintain and deliver air superiority. I think it's fair to say it's one of the most important aspects of your job. But let's say it's lost, or let's say that's a failure. What is the Air Force learning from Ukraine about how to operate in an environment where the airspace is contested, to do campaign planning?
Well, part of the aspect of campaign planning, and it's something, as you look at our own, how we operate in the past, one of the first things we try to do is take down the air defenses. But the other part of that is not only what we do as an Air Force, but also what we do with the Joint Team. Because the Joint Team has capabilities as well to take down the air defenses. But it's not only taking down the air defenses, it's how you not only use the kinetic aspects, but also non-kinetic. Whether it's electronic warfare, whether it's cyber, and looking at all the capabilities we have in our toolkit to complicate things for our adversaries so that we can actually, from an air power perspective, get in and provide air superiority. The thing I also think about, because the threat scenarios have gotten more challenging, we cannot take air superiority for granted. And I think because we've often operated with air superiority, it's very easy for us to take it for granted that you'll have it all the time. Part of our mission statement is a fly, fight, win, air power anytime, anywhere. That's what we're shooting for. But at the same time, we also got to understand it takes the right capability, the right investments to make that happen. And we got to do that together with our joint teammates, but also with our allies and partners. And this is why it's important that we try to make sure that we don't outpace we want to outpace our facing challenge, but at the same time, we don't want to outpace our allies and partners as well. We got to make sure we're all moving together to make sure we can be a very robust combined fighting force.
Hi, everybody. Aaron Stein here. I wanted to take a quick break to tell you about our membership program. We have 4 podcasts, from our thrice weekly Warcast, examining geopolitical events, to The Insider, which features interviews with our authors. We also have Unspent Rounds, which features interesting conversations with interesting people, and of course, The Russia Contingency with Michael Kaufman. We have also launched Mid-Afternoon Map, a cartographically inspired newsletter, and In Brief, a newsletter that tackles a new global issue each week, explained by 3 experts in 100 words or less. Head on over to www.warontherocks.com/membership to find out more.
You got a lot of attention with Accelerate, Change, or Lose. I mean, first, can you just explain to our listeners who might not know what that was, the basics about that?
Sure. So when I came in as the chief, I had a small team with me that was working transition. I personally, for my time as a general officer, working mostly in combat commands, working with allies and partners, I was not working internal to the Air Force. And I could watch the Air Force from the outside. I also knew where the threat was going based on having served time in the Middle East, in Europe, and now in the Indo-Pacific right before becoming the chief. And I knew we needed to go faster. What I really started looking at is what are the things we need to do and what was at risk if we didn't go faster and accelerate. It's the aspect of losing in a major conflict. It's losing aspects of our national security. It's losing our credibility. It's losing credibility with our allies and partners. It's losing quality airmen and their families. And so it's a combination of things I felt like we needed to move forward on. In order to do that, I also knew that we had to collaborate. And so one of the key words in Accelerate, Change, or Lose was collaborate and collaboration. Because I knew I could not do this by myself. It was going to require us to do some analysis and work within the Department of Defense, but also collaborate with Congress and with the industry and with the allies and partners. As a result, I personally have made it my focus is to engage with internal to the Department of Defense, with the combatant commanders, and with members on the Hill and with industry. And I do see that we're making progress in that regard as we've gone and engaged with all those key stakeholders. Because I think the more we engage and talk to them about what we're trying to do, and then get their feedback and their advice about how best to approach this, we can move forward. I often say success takes help, failure you can do alone. That success that we're starting to see is because we're working together and getting buy-in, because we're socializing before we just, try to make a decision, try to sell it without input, because, you have a number of key stakeholders that have perspectives, have equities. If you don't think about their perspective and equities, you're not going to be able to move very far. I know there's going to be some things we disagree on, but the way I try to operate is I try to think about a Venn diagram and find the areas we do agree on and move those forward. And as you do that, you build a relationship. And some of the things you might disagree about may start to dissolve because you build a relationship. And then you find that you can talk to each other and build trust. And then you're talking to each other versus past each other. And it's just the way I've operated throughout my, particularly as a senior officer. I think I probably operate that way throughout most of my career. And I see that it's actually helping us to move the ball forward when we start thinking about accelerating. And I think a measure for me, when I go over to Capitol Hill in testimony, and members of Congress say accelerate, change, or lose, it's starting to stick. And they understand that we have to move forward.
About a year ago at the press club, you gave yourself a solid C. I won't ask you to give yourself a grade now on how it's going with accelerate, change, or lose. But if you could go back and give yourself advice, if the General Brown of today could go back to the General Brown of then, give some advice on what that General Brown should think about differently when writing that document, aside from revealing there's going to be a pandemic and other major disruptions and a war in Europe. But what would that advice be?
That's a good question. To be honest with you, I'm not sure I would have changed too much. My appetite for change is bigger than I'm now starting to realize it's hard to do, which I kind of already knew. I mean, one reason I gave myself a C, and actually some folks came back to me later and said, you're being too hard on yourself. Okay. The reason I gave myself a C is because, one of my parts of the action orders that support accelerate, change, or lose was action order B on bureaucracy. That, to me, I'd say was what drove down my grade point average. Because what you find is there's those in entities that are stuck in the way they do things, and they've had a hard time making a change. That's an area that I don't know if there's anything I could do differently there. Maybe some more socialization early in the process of what we're trying to achieve. I've learned a few things throughout the path. One of those was, I've had a couple of dinners on how to work with Congress and have a better understanding of working with Congress. And one of the folks that we had at one of our events, who had been a previous staffer, told me the absence of a yes is not a no. And I think we as an Air Force sometimes, if we didn't get a yes at what we wanted to do, we come back with another plan to see if we can get a yes. Versus sticking with the plan, continue to socialize, continue to get advice, and figure out how best to move it forward. And I think I've taken that to heart, and we've been able to move some things forward by continuing to have dialogue versus throwing in a towel and starting all over again.
We published an article that I know you've read, sent it over, on argued combat support is the weak link in the Air Force. First, can you describe to our audience, especially the non-airmen who are listening, what that means, what combat support is, and then your view of that argument and where combat support...
I think, when you think about combat support, you could probably put it in one word, logistics. But it's more than the logistics. It's the aspects of, logistics. It's your ability to communicate. It's your ability to shelter and feed your airmen when they're deployed. So it's all those things that kind of come together. It is very easy to focus on what I would call the bright, shiny object of the operational part of it, but you can't do any of that without the combat support. I often say that our aircraft are all static displays without combat support. If you don't have the fuel, you don't have the maintenance, you don't have the airmen, those airplanes are going to stay parked on the ramp. And so that combat support sometimes is underestimated how complicated it is, and the more we just kind of wish it away, the more we put at risk. And so we've really got to think about that. Matter of fact, here, I have a major conference coming up here in June, and we're going to do a logistics tabletop exercise to work through aspects of the things we would have to do in the Indo-Pacific. And we've been doing some small-scale exercises ahead of that big major exercise so we can actually start, educating, socializing, and really thinking through all the things that really have to happen to make a major operation like that happen, be able to execute in an environment that we haven't operated. We've been going to the Middle East for the past 30 years. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's pretty easy because we got a pretty good system. When you're doing something starting from scratch, you want to stay as far ahead as you can. And this is why we're trying to do this tabletop exercise to work through. And then once what we learn from that is now how do we make some adjustments so that we appreciate the things from a combat support standpoint that we don't have, that we need, and how we start to mitigate those areas or invest in areas that are going to help us do the combat support mission areas much better than we do today.
Yeah, and since early on, since you took this role, if I recall correctly, contested logistics has been one of the major areas you wanted the service to focus on, and so this seems to fit in that.
It does, and again, just like I talked about air superiority being assumed away, I think sometimes the logistics gets assumed away that it's just going to show up on time. That's not going to be the case. By the same token, we can't have an iron mountain of capability sitting someplace waiting for, because we'll have it sitting someplace and invariably it'll be sitting in the wrong place. And so we really got to think more deeply about how we do this. And this is why I think our information tools are so important to us. We think about like advanced battle management system, joint all-domain command and control. It's not just about the operational piece. It's also how we use that to help drive the logistics of what we're going to be able to do and how we get the combat support at the right place at the right time to support combat operations.
There's been this explosion of AI products that the general public have been able to use, from ChatGPT to DALL-E 2 and all these other so-called generative AI technologies that have created a lot of excited speculation and analysis on how this is going to change our world, to include military operations. Do you worry that the Air Force will not be culturally ready to accept AI as fast as it maybe needs to? And there were problems with the Air Force accepting drones, for example. Do you foresee similar problems? And how do you think AI is going to start playing more into? If that's not a big enough question, I can make it even bigger.
No. I think that we will be able to adapt, but it's not just how the Air Force adapted, it's also how outside of the Air Force adapts as well. I think with anything new, you're going to have, what you would say your early adopters and your laggards. And there's aspects of the Air Force that will be early adopters, depending on, what career field they're in and what problem they're trying to solve, or what technology and how it marries up with what they're trying to get done. And you'll have some laggards that just are not ready to get there. I'll tell you, one of the aspects when you talked about remotely part of the aircraft or drones, it wasn't only what we were trying to do in terms of the Air Force, but we also, in order to find it in the national airspace, we had to work with the Federal Aviation Administration. And so that also is it's those kinds of factors, that the things that we do internal, but it's also the other things that happen external to the Air Force or policies we have within our government that may slow some things down, or how do we put the right safeguards in place going forward? One of the key areas I think in order to do AI, and I've spent a little bit of time studying this, in order to do artificial intelligence, you got to have data. The key part for us now is how do we get access to our own data and put it in the right place so you can build the models that operate off the right data. The question I've asked, it's kind of being facetious. I go, if I had data and I wanted to share it, who do I go to make that come together? And we're working that really hard inside General to the Air Force. And we've actually have done some projects to really bring data together, make it more accessible, and then be able to use certain tools to help us make better decisions going forward. I see AI is going to help us get there, but I still think we're in the early stages. And the way I kind of described it is when cyber came about, probably 10, 15 years ago, we had cyber on a lot of PowerPoint slides, and people were hawking cyber like it was going to be the panacea. I think we're in a better spot with cyber. I think the same thing we'll be there with AI, but we can't wait 10 to 15 years to get there, though.
Yeah. On the data sharing, you reminded me of Deputy Secretary Kathix's memo on the data directives.
Right.
Basically, the summary of it is saying to everyone in DoD, this is not your data, this is our data, and there needs to be more data sharing in the department. And it seems like that's just a wicked problem of cultural issues, bureaucratic roadblocks, and it's not surprising to me that it's taking so much time to figure out.
I think there's aspects of that, but there's also the aspects of having the right people who understand data, that really understand data, versus someone like me who uses data, has data, but doesn't understand how to put it in a place to manipulate it. And so one of the things we've been able to do is, in the combination of data, data scientists, data analysts, internal to the Air Force, both in uniform, civilian, and some contractors that work with us, and some companies that actually do this for a living, and have them work with us. And I've been able to do this in, for example, as a Chief of Staff of the Air Force, one of my key roles is managing our General Officer Force Development. And so we've been working with a company. We have a number of data tools and data sets that tell me about my general officers, the positions they go into. And so what I've been able to do is get this company to work with us closely to be able to use all that data that we already have and then pull it together so we're able to ask questions and then be able to say, I'm looking for a general officer that has these attributes to fill these jobs. And now I can get a list based on their bios and their experiences. I wouldn't be able to do that before. I would go ask, one of our officers to go do that, and they would basically start reading bios, and it would take them, several weeks versus what we can do today in a matter of minutes. And that's the things that I think we got to be able to do with their data and having the right people. We have several people that have, backgrounds in data. We have a major who I spend time talking to as a PhD in data science. That's the kind of things we need more in our Air Force to be able to move the data where it needs to go.
The majority of general and flag officers that I meet are passionate about leadership. Having spent the day with you and read a bit about you, you seem to have an extra intense passion for leadership. And I watched you give some talks today that I really enjoyed. And it was interesting seeing you talk, you didn't phrase it this way, but seeing you talk about leadership as both an art and a science, as something that can be measured, but also something that takes intuition and creativity. And I was just wondering if you wanted to share what do you think made you as passionate about leadership as you are, and how you think about leadership and the position that you're in as opposed to past positions that you've held.
Part of the reason I'm passionate about leadership is I want to do positive things. I want to make sure that the organizations I'm privileged to lead are better when I leave. I do not care that my name's associated with it. I just want to walk away to make it better. And part of that, making the organization better, is the aspect of how I make those that come behind me better. One of the key jobs that a leader has is to build the leaders that come behind you. And so for me personally, I love the aspect of mentoring. I love sitting down and talking to our airmen about leadership. I love taking their questions on leadership. I love, just the aspect of the books I read on leadership, the podcasts I listen to often about leadership. And I love the challenge. I mean, I often say I'd rather be busy than bored. I'd rather be, in some cases when we have tasks, I'd rather be the person that has the task versus the person who's being tasked to go execute and sit on the sidelines. And part of that leadership is being able to have confidence in yourself. I often talk about attitude and the aspect of attitude. That attitude is confidence. And that's what I look for in people, that they're confident in themselves, and they're even confident if they don't know the answer. They can say, I don't know the answer, but I'm willing to go find out. The other aspect of attitude is having a positive attitude, because not everything's going to go perfectly. And to know that, some things won't go perfectly, and when it doesn't go well, that you can dust yourself off, pick up, and go, we can get this done. And have the confidence that we can try again and continue to move forward.
One thing that you said today that I found very motivating is that you consider yourself an action officer. Can you unpack that? Because it's not a standard thing for a very senior leader to say or think, in my opinion.
Yeah. So part of the reason why I say that I'm an action officer is I like to be involved in the process. What I really try to do is have a dialogue. So one example I'll share with you is I like to get read-aheads for whatever meeting I'm going to go into, because I actually read them. And then when we go into a meeting and someone's going to brief me, my staff kind of knows now. They'll ask me a question like, do you have anything you want to say before we start the brief? Because sometimes they don't brief. We have a conversation. Because I start going, I've read through your stuff. I have some questions. I want to talk to you about these questions I have. I want to dig it deeper than what the bullet that was on the slide or what was in the paper. And we have a dialogue. And then at the end I go, okay, is there anything in your brief or your paper that you wanted to cover that we did not cover because you didn't brief. And sometimes there might be something, but I actually get more out of that, and I think they do as well, because now we're moving whatever we're working on, in the process together versus they brief me, waiting for me to say yes or no, watching my body language, and then they're trying to read between the lines. I think the dialogue helps them get inside my mind, and trying the same thing with them to be able to kind of pull out where their concerns are, the information they know, or the aspect of the secondary impacts that they're concerned about. If I make a decision in a certain direction or make a vector, I want to hear from them to go, sir, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And I want to understand why. And I want to tell them, I might have to tell them, we're going to do this, and here's why, because of some other things that they may not be aware of.
And I see that you spend a lot of time talking to very small groups of airmen. What do you think that delivers to them, and what do you think that gives you that's important as a leader?
Well, it gives me energy, for one, and it gives me opportunity to feedback, and it also gives me an opportunity to grow the next generation. I think that one of the key responsibilities as a leader is to build the leaders that come behind you. And so I love mentoring. I love sitting down in small groups talking about leadership. And there is no, easy answer to leadership. And so what I hope to share when I sit down with these small groups is just, stories of my experience and the times that you're going to be in tough situations, and you can't throw in a towel, and you're not always going to get it right. I love taking questions and answers on leadership.
And they ask real hard questions too, I've noticed.
They do. As I was sharing with you earlier today, I always get a little nervous when they stand up and they've got their phone in their hand with the question already typed out, ready to go, or have a notebook, which means they couldn't wait to, waiting for me to show up. And I know they've really thought through what they want to ask me, which means I've really got to think through the answer I'm going to provide. Because sometimes you only have one chance to make that impression. And I want to make sure that, the answer I provide them is helpful to what they're trying to smoke out, that's going to make them a better leader one day.
What are some books that have been important in making you who you are as a professional and a person?
Well, one of my favorite books is Lincoln on Leadership by Donald T. Phillips. It's a book I came across as a captain. It's a book I share often with people, just because of the way Lincoln led. And he led in crisis. And I think that's where a sign of leadership, those that can lead in crisis and be successful, to me, is a sign of leadership. I also, try to look at books that, provide you a different perspective on leadership that's not necessarily military. And so one of the ones like I highlighted today was Start With Why by Simon Sinek. It's A Sell As Human by Daniel Pink. Because in leadership, you're a salesperson. You're trying to get people to buy into the vision you have and then be able to go forward. And people that want to work with you just want to understand why you're doing it sometimes. The other is No Rules, the culture and reinvention of Netflix, and how Netflix evolved itself from little red envelopes to the big streaming platform that they are today. And the a couple of freedom and responsibility, leadership by context, not by control. Those are the kind of books I read. I'm also reading biographies as well, and to learn the background on individuals and how they became successful. Because there's something in their growing up, in their experience, that makes them the leader that they are.
Your wife's sitting here across from us. What was the best assignment for you as a family that you had in the Air Force?
Our best assignment for us was we were at Aviano Air Base in Italy. We were hour north of Venice. It was our first overseas assignment as a family. Our boys were high school, middle school, and so it's something they remembered. We remember as a family because we got to travel a lot together, spend a lot of time together. And so that to me was, as a family, it was probably one of my favorite assignments. One assignment that was also where family wasn't necessarily there with me, she was with me, was when I was the Air Component Commander for CENTCOM during the Defeat ISIS campaign. And just watching what our airmen were able to do. Every day I would have a Excel spreadsheet that was the air tasking order. And I knew every day we had airmen out on flight lines across the CENTCOM area of responsibility that turned that piece of paper into reality. That to me was motivating. Because I knew when I went out to see them, all the things they were able to do to load an airplane, to fuel the airplane, to build munitions, to bed people down. And they did it. I mean, I was so proud of the things they were able to do during that time frame. And for me just to be a part of it was tremendous.
What was your favorite watering hole that you came across throughout your Air Force career?
The 2-5 Club in Nellis, it's no longer there. But when I was a student at the weapons school or an instructor, particularly as a student, so it was across the street from the base. You could actually walk from the club to the 2-5 club after the club shut down, and they had the best hot wings. That's where we go sulk after a tough week at the weapons school. But that was probably one of my favorites. It's probably most memorable for those that probably shut down a number of years ago, but there was one that I finally remember.
Please don't forget to check out the membership program that we offer here at War on the Rocks. You get access to multiple premium podcasts, premium newsletters, a closed members-only forum, all sorts of stuff, ever expanding all the time at a reasonable price. Check it out at warontherocks.com/membership.